Thank you for joining us. This is the first webinar in a series by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And the title of this webinar is Truth and History, Federal Indian Boarding Schools in the U.S. And Dinawe Magani Duke, Diindiisi Indishinakaz, Makinakwaju Indunjiba, Migizi Indudame. And what I just said in Ojibwe is, greetings, my relatives. My name is Diindiisi, which means Blue Jay. And I'm from Turtle Mountain Reservation, and I'm Eagle Clan. So my English name is Christine McCleave, and I'm the Executive Officer for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. And I believe you all got my bio when you registered for the GoToWebinar meeting. Let's do a quick poll. So on that right-hand panel, you can also see that there's a section with a poll. And I've just launched a poll that asks you all if you are a boarding school survivor or a descendant or neither. And so I'm just going to leave that poll open for a minute while people respond. It looks like we're at, this is great. I love technology. We're at 75% of you have already responded. That's wonderful. I love that I can see that in real time. And it looks like we do have a few boarding school survivors on the line. Thank you for joining us. You're the reason we do this work. And it looks like we have about a third of you are boarding school descendants. And I'm also a descendant of a boarding school survivor, so we are also part of this work. And then we have a lot of you who are neither and are just interested, so that's great. I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. About 90% of you have voted, so thank you. And I'm going to do one more poll that asks what sector you're listening in from. Are you with tribal services or urban Indian services, social work, child welfare, academia or education, legal or other? And this one's multiple, so you can choose all that apply. So you might be social work in a tribal environment or child welfare in an urban environment. Just to kind of get a handle on, who's interested in our educational resources that we're providing. And it looks like we don't have, we have a few of you from the legal section, the legal sector, just a small percentage. Majority said other, so I was only able to select 5 responses for you all. So curious to know what other would be. So yeah, it looks like the majority of you are in education or in academia. And about a quarter of you are tribal services or urban Indian services, and 14% social work and child welfare. So I'm going to go ahead and close that poll as well. Thank you all for participating. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about our organization and then get into our the rest of the content for today. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, or NABS for short, is a 501c3 nonprofit. We were started by the Native American Rights Fund in 2012 after a national symposium that happened in response to the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was going on in Canada from 2010 to 2015. And we are a coalition. We have a membership, and you can be a regular member or an affiliate member. Regular members are tribal citizens, enrolled tribal citizens, or if you can prove descent of an enrolled tribal citizen. And affiliate members are non-Native allies or Indigenous peoples from outside the U.S. Our coalition is made up of individuals who are free to join, and tribal organizations and Native and non-Native organizations. And if you're a tribe or an organization, there is a fee for membership. And our board of directors is made up of 100% Native Americans, and you have to be a regular member in order to be on the board of directors. So we're very proud of that fact, and it's important to us for our work and our mission that that we are led by Native people. And that our work is not just for, but by Native people. Our vision is Indigenous cultural sovereignty, restoring what was lost and damaged through the boarding school era. And our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that was created by the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. So today we're going to talk about the history of the boarding schools, the military, federal government, and church roles, the personal stories of those who experienced boarding school, some of the impacts, the intergenerational trauma as a result of those experiences, and then what communities are doing to heal historical trauma today, as well as some of our programs at NABS. So just a quick, 10,000 feet view of boarding school history from the early 1800s actually to present day. Mission schools and boarding schools have been a part of U.S. experience for Native Americans. And it's something that's largely written out of the history books. It's not taught in our school's curriculum. And nobody really knows how many boarding schools there were in the U.S. There's different numbers that are floating around there, but what we've found through our research is that there are 357 boarding schools. These were government funded, and about half of them were church run. The purpose of these boarding schools was to assimilate Native Americans into Western society, and the result was genocide. Indian children were forcibly abducted and taken to these schools, and in the beginning, there were things implemented to make sure that they did go to those schools even against their parents' wishes. They were sent hundreds of miles away, so the strategy was to create these off-reservation boarding schools, because originally, if they created a school that was on the reservation, the people who were leading those schools called it going back to the blanket, when the children would go home at night and speak their tribal language and engage in their tribal cultures. So the strategy was to take them off the reservation, remove them from their family and their community. And when they got there, they were stripped of their clothes, their hair was cut, and they were given often a number rather than a name. These were military-style schools. Many students were neglected, malnourished, and experienced abuse. The motto of these schools, the first most famous school was Carlisle School in Pennsylvania, and their motto was to kill the Indian, save the man. And the graduating class of 1898 at Carlisle was told to let all that is Indian within you die. So how could something like this happen in the United States and in other countries around the world who modeled boarding schools for their Aboriginal or Indigenous peoples after the U.S. boarding schools? They did that in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Well, it's because of the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny. So this slide that I'm showing right now is a bit of a quote from a papal bull. And that papal bull is a document that is issued by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And you can see here that it says, speaking as God's representative on earth, the popes anointed these rulers and their representatives as sanctified conquerors of anything they discovered not already claimed by Christian rulers. So the doctrine of discovery was basically used to say that as these European explorers went out into the world, if they encountered lands that weren't being occupied or used by Christian people, then they could lay claim to that land under this doctrine of the Catholic Church. So this painting that is being projected is called American Progress, and it's by John Gast from 1872. And this is kind of symbolizing the idea of manifest destiny that came out in the U.S. as a result of the doctrine of discovery. And you can see the angel that is depicted here. Her name is Columbia, and she is moving from the east to the west. And on the east there, she's stringing a telephone wire. There is the railroad and a stagecoach. Off in the distance, there's a port town. And in the forefront, there is agriculture. And to the west, she's chasing away the indigenous people and the buffalo. And so this really does symbolize that idea that it was American progress and that it was manifest destiny, and that the civilization that was being brought to this land was superior. So we talk about boarding schools as one layer of trauma that happened for Indigenous people on Turtle Island. And we talk about it in the context of all the federal policies that did harm to our tribal nations. And really, everything was aimed at stripping Indigenous peoples of our rights and our assets, namely land. Everything was about land. So from contact, we have, the first layers of trauma that started happening to our peoples, which was invasion of our lands and removal. They created reservation systems in exchange for the land that we were ceding through those treaties. And not always, were those treaties being signed by people who really represented the tribe and the community. So people resisted and said, we didn't agree to this. We don't want to move on to this reservation. And the result was that the U.S. Engaged in war. So there was a period of Indian wars. And then there was the period that began with the boarding schools, and that would be the assimilation period, in which, they really stopped the wars and tried to figure out different strategy because it was very expensive. And the U.S. was engaged in many different wars with tribes across the entire U.S. And so one of the other things that happened during that assimilation period that was a strategy of the Army was to try to exterminate all the buffalo, which was the main subsistence of the Plains tribes. And they killed the buffalo to near extinctions right around the same time that the Civil War was happening and boarding schools were going into full swing. Then we have the reorganization and termination era. Really, reorganization was forcing tribes to adopt a constitution like the U.S. and move them into an assimilative way of governing their tribes. And they were also encouraging people to move off the reservation, move to urban areas. And we also see changes in boarding schools around this time. Moving from boarding schools to the Indian adoption era, which we'll talk about later. And then we have the self-determination era, which leads into the present, where we are still fighting for our rights and the rights to govern ourselves, the rights to our lands and our children. So like I mentioned, the first off-reservation federal Indian boarding school was Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And that was a school that was created by Richard Pratt. He retired a general, but at certain times he was a captain or a colonel. So the quote on the screen is quoted when he was a captain. And he says, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So that was Pratt's motto. And he wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses because he felt that as a Christian person, he was more compassionate, that he didn't think that the Indian War should continue, and that the Indians were capable of being civilized, in his words, as the result of an experiment that he ran on some prisoners of war at Hampton, where he taught these men to read, write, and speak English. And he trained them to be soldiers. And that was the beginning of his experiment. And he used that to convince the federal government to let him open the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And so the picture that you see here is an iconic photo from the boarding school era. It's often referred to as the Sea of Children. And this is the student body at Carlisle. So how could church-run boarding schools be federally funded? Isn't there supposed to be separation of church and state? Well, there wasn't one boarding school policy in the U.S. Instead, it was a series of policies. And so in 1819, the Indian Civilization Fund was created. And this was funds that were meant to be used to help the Native Americans through the treaties. They in exchange for the land, they were promised education, rations, food, subsistence, and health care. And so they decided that they would, in trying to civilize the Native Americans, would create this fund, and that their goal was to transform Indians into farmers and laborers like everyone else. And so in 1824, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was created. Interestingly enough, it was created under the Department of War, because that was the primary department that dealt with Native Americans at the time, and they were to administer the monies from the Civilization Fund. And it was in 1868 that Grant's peace policy was implemented, and the problem was that some of the Indian agents in the BIA were corrupt. They were not delivering rations. They were stealing monies, and the Dakota 38 plus 2, if anyone is familiar with that part of history, the Dakota 38 plus 2 that were hanged was the result of an Indian agent who was withholding rations during a terrible winter blizzard. And they had the rations, but the tickets hadn't been delivered. And so he wouldn't give people food, and they were starving. And he said, let them eat grass. And so later he was found murdered with grass stuffed in his mouth. And so as a result of all these corrupt Indian agents and the disputes that were coming out of, the turmoil there, Grant's peace policy aimed to replace these agents with Christian missionaries who were, thought to going to be more moral. And so they were able to receive monies from the Indian Civilization Fund, and that is how they opened the way for federally funded church-run boarding schools. Oops. So these are some of the denominations that ran Indian boarding schools. About half the church-run schools, the majority of them were Catholic-run, but as you can see, there are other denominations there. And in 1824, the Indian Civilization Fund subsidized 32 schools that enrolled more than 900 Indian children. And by 1830, the Indian Civilization Fund supported 52 schools with 1,500 enrolled students. During the 60 years between 1819 and 1879, most of the church-run schools were on or near the reservations. But like I mentioned earlier, the children would return home, and this was not in their eyes creating the type of assimilation that they were aiming for. So I also mentioned earlier that they really did enforce these children being taken in the early generations of the boarding school era. The Grant's peace policy wrote it so that, and Congress authorized so that the Secretary of the Interior could withhold food and subsistence from those families that were not sending their children to school. They could also incarcerate the parents. So here is pictured 19 Hopi men who were designated as hostiles. They were taken into custody by the U.S. Army on November 25th, 1894, and incarcerated at Alcatraz. Their crime was that they opposed the forced removal and education of their children in government boarding schools. They were held in confinement and at hard labor until they fully realized the error of their evil ways, quote, until they shall evince in an unmistakable manner a desire to cease interference with the plans of the government for the civilization and education of its Indian wards, end quote. They were at Alcatraz for 7 months. So this is a photo of Tom Torlino. It's also a very iconic photo of the boarding school era. Pratt at Carlisle created these type of propaganda intentionally. He hired a photographer to take these before and after photos because he wanted to show that his experiment was working. What's interesting about Tom is that when we look into his records, he was sent there as a prisoner of war. And as you can see, he's not a child. He's a full-grown man. And at our first conference that NABS held in October last year in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, we had the privilege of hearing from Tom Torlino's great-granddaughter, and she attended our conference and she gave a presentation, and she talked about how she and her family felt about their relative being used as this icon of the boarding school era. And it just serves as a reminder to us that even with these historical photos that are, technically and legally in the public domain, that we have a moral obligation to recognize that these are people's relatives. So this photo does show, however, what happened to the students upon arrival. So the civilizing process began immediately. They were stripped of any clothing, whether it was their traditional clothing in the early generations or in later generations when they would have been more assimilated. They were still stripped of any clothing that they arrived in. Their hair was cut and in a military style. And they were deloused, often with very harsh chemicals. In some cases, we know that it was DDT that they were putting on the children. We have a quote here from an Apache student who remembered this process and said, "We lost our hair and we lost our clothes. With the two, we'd lost our identities as Indians. Greater punishment could hardly have been devised." As I mentioned, a lot of these schools, whether they were federal or church run, had a military style. They used corporal punishment. They dressed the students in military uniforms, and they assigned the students a number. So we have a quote here that says, "They gave me the number 76. I was number 76. All my clothes, underwear, socks, dresses had the number 76. When my laundry came back folded, it had a slip on the paper on top with the number 76 on it." And another student said, "Wearing school clothing and marching uniforms was mandatory to impose conformity and the military discipline on the students. Upon their arrival, traditional clothing seen as a shell of savagery was literally cast off." This slide is an example of how they also, with the clothing, changed our ceremonies. So on the left is a Cheyenne woman who's in her traditional ceremonial dress, and on the right is a wedding portrait with her husband. So again, a wedding ceremony. It's a different ceremony from a different culture and a different style of dress. The students were used as labor, either at the school or they were sent on outings. So this photo is at Tulalip from 1912, and the boarding schools had what was called the half and half system, where students spent half the day in the classroom and half at work assignment or on detail on the school grounds. Many students learned trades, but the purpose was always to assimilate them. Some of the trades that they were taught were wagon making, shoemaking, harness making, blacksmithing, carpentry, tin working, cabinet making, bakery, farming, dairy farming, sewing, cooking, and doing the laundry. So when my great-grandfather was at Carlisle, he was also sent on outing, and the farmers who hired these students gave the wages to the school. And the school deposited a percentage into the student's account. And this is at Carlisle. Each school was different. But my great-grandfather had a dispute about the amount of money that he was getting, and he wasn't receiving all of his wages. We know that in many cases, the students were sewing the uniforms, growing the food that was being used to feed the students, and building the buildings. In some cases, if a student died, they had to build the casket and bury the student themselves as well. So in 1928, the Merriam Report basically highlighted a lot of the human rights violations that were going on at these schools. On page 382 of the report, it says, "Nearly every boarding school visited furnished disquieting illustrations of a failure to understand the underlying principles of human behavior. Punishments of the most harmful sort are bestowed in sheer ignorance." The report cites malnourishment, poor living conditions, hard labor and long days, corporal punishment, a lack of family life which led to poor mental health, and no follow-up. A subsequent report in 1969, referred to as the Kennedy Report, declared Indian education to be a national tragedy in the US and said that the care of Indian children in boarding schools was grossly inadequate. So after each of these reports, some boarding schools closed down, and after the 69 report, if any of the schools were remaining as open, they were transferred into the authority of the tribe. And as around that time, as we were entering the self-determination era, the Indian Education Act was passed, and parents and tribes began to have much more say and control over Indian education. So as the children were told, let all that is Indian within you die, what we know now from the definition of genocide from the United Nations is that forcibly transferring children of a group to another group is included in that definition of genocide. Outside of boarding schools, all these other aspects of the definition of genocide have also occurred here in the US, and genocide has happened with the indigenous peoples here. And in Canada, after the Truth and Reconciliation, they called what happened with the boarding schools cultural genocide. And, we've had discussions here at the coalition about whether to call it cultural genocide or genocide, but really cultural genocide is genocide, and it meets the definition of genocide. Also, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was passed 10 years ago, states that Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. So, we could have used that about 100 years ago. And also on the screen are a couple of books that refer to what happened here in the US as the American Holocaust and the American Genocide. Yet it is still largely unacknowledged in this country. Also, the Indian boarding schools were the first Indian child welfare policy of the US, when you think about it. It was the first policy they made about Indian children. And as Indian boarding schools started to wane, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project, again, aimed at assimilating Indian children. But this time, instead of sending them to boarding school, they just moved them straight into a white family. And they found very dubious ways to take the children. We have accounts of mothers signing release forms in the hospital, thinking it was to, be released from the hospital with their child, when in fact they were releasing custody of their child. And you can see here that they would place ads in the newspaper about these children. We have another newspaper clipping where it says, "The children come in all hues and colors." And this was promoted as federal policy under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act came into enactment to prevent our children from being removed from our families and our homes simply because they were Native American. And despite ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, Native children are still placed at higher rates per capita than any other ethnic group in the country. So another thing that we know about the boarding schools is that, especially with the outing programs and moving into the adoption era, foster care and adoption era, was that they had no accountability. So here on screen you see a copy of a letter that was sent to the Chippewa Indian Mission School in 1952. And somebody has donated $10 to the school. This is a Catholic boarding school, and they've asked for a child, a girl or a boy. And the person writes, the superintendent writes back and says, I have the perfect child in mind. They're very little trouble at all. No one cares if they live or die or come or go. And then he says, if you really mean it, I will see that we will get him ready. You may have him anytime you desire. I'm not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did. And he's referring to the donation. So nowadays, we would refer to this as human trafficking. And if the child was sexually abused, then we would say this is sex trafficking as well. In 2014, the White House report on Native youth declared a state of emergency, that we had a suicide epidemic with our youth across the country. And this report cited that our youth had PTSD rates 3 times the general public, post-traumatic stress rates the same rate as Iraqi war veterans. And what we know is that this is the result of historical and intergenerational trauma. So here are a few books that have personal stories from the boarding school era. Sherman Alexie's book, You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, has a chapter with a very haunting story of boarding school abuse. And just the title of that book makes reference to what a lot of boarding school descendants have noted, is that if they had a parent that went to boarding school, that parent had trouble showing affection or saying, I love you. As they had been raised by an institution where they did not see that type of affection being modeled when they were children. And Pipestone is a book by Adam Fortunate Eagle about the Pipestone boarding school here in Minnesota. A story of Chilocco Indian School by Tsanina Loema called They Called It Prairie Light. And Tim Giaggio, The Children They Left Behind. So those are a few books if you're interested in reading stories and testimonies. Here are photos of my family's boarding school history. My grandfather, pictured on the right, is Lawrence Willett. He attended Marty Catholic Indian School in South Dakota, even though he's from Turtle Mountain, North Dakota. And then later he attended Haskell in Kansas. And that's, he attended at the time, it was a trade school before it became a junior college, and then eventually a full-blown university. On the right is John Willett, my great-grandfather, who went to Carlisle in 1910 to 1915, and he actually got to play football with Jim Thorpe, which is pretty amazing. However, that history was not talked about in my family. I didn't know that my great-grandfather went to Carlisle until I had actually been working at the Boarding School Healing Coalition for about 6 months. I was asking family members about my grandfather's boarding school experience, trying to find out the years that he went to Marty and Haskell. And that's when my uncle sent me this picture of my great-grandfather and said, you know, he went to Carlisle and played football with Jim Thorpe. He was recruited there by Pop Warner. So I find that very interesting, that although that's a positive thing for my family, it's also a sad piece of our history, in that there's, you know, one more generation of boarding school experience in our family. And it's really interesting to me that nobody ever talked about it, that I didn't even know that we had that connection to Carlisle until I started asking questions. So here on screen are a few more pictures that include my great-grandfather, John Willett. However, these were not from our family photo album. These are historical photos that I saw in someone else's presentation, which was very odd for me to be seeing one of my relatives in someone else's presentation. So again, just that reminder about the fact that these are people's relatives. And if you see your relative on screen, let me know. So because my grandfather had gone to a Catholic boarding school, and I knew he never talked about his experiences there. He didn't want to talk about it. If anyone asked him, that's what he would say. He had already passed away by the time I started to be interested in asking him, so I didn't have the opportunity. But I do know that he had resentments against the Catholic Church. When my uncle was being married up in Turtle Mountain, you know, the church, big nice church on the reservation, is a Catholic church, St. Anne's up there on the hill. And my grandfather almost didn't attend the wedding because he said he didn't want to step foot in the Catholic Church. So this and, my own experiences with growing up Catholic and then later realizing the true history and the implications that organized religion had played in Native history, I decided when I went to do my master's degree to research Native American spirituality and Christianity and to explore the intersection of those two paradigms. So my master's thesis is titled Spiritual Leadership in Modern Day Native American Culture and Approaches to Native American Religion and Christianity. I interviewed spiritual leaders in the Twin Cities, Minnesota, and asked them about the practices in their congregation, and the result was that the practices of Native people was falling along a spectrum of those who practice Christianity exclusively to those who practice Native American religion exclusively. And then in the middle were those who were blending Christianity with Native culture and practices, and the majority of people fell into the middle, kind of like a bell curve. And as far as conflict and compatibility, the biggest area of conflict was around the roles of spirits, angels, demons, or ancestors, depending on which perspective they hailed from and what they would call those entities. And really, what that is to say is basically that the people who were practicing Christianity exclusively were uncomfortable with the animism that was present in a lot of Native American religion, and basically said that including ancestors and spirits in their practices was demonic or not biblical. And so that was the greatest area of conflict. And those who practice blended Christianity and spirituality seem much more tolerant of other people's spiritual practices and religious beliefs. And those churches that were blending also had cultural activities. They hosted language classes. They seem more involved in community activism. So the conclusions of my research was that the history of the church and Native Americans cannot be overlooked and, in fact, must be addressed for the well-being and spiritual health of Native American people. That church leaders who continue to teach that Native American culture is non-biblical or evil may be perpetuating the cultural genocide and human rights violations of the Indian boarding schools and other Christians who have criminalized Native religion. And that taking an active role in reconciliation and reparations as a spiritual leader can help heal generational trauma caused by boarding schools and other historical traumas, and can produce healthy Native Americans inside and outside the church. My recommendations were that the church and its leaders should not ignore their role in the history of assimilating Native Americans in North America, and that the cultural and spiritual devastation that these actions brought. Because I did actually find that. I found churches that did not want to acknowledge the history. So intergenerational trauma that resulted as consequences of the boarding school experience. There's the term historical trauma and intergenerational trauma, and they differ a bit. Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart coined the term historical trauma, and she describes it as defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation following loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. So Dr. Maria did come to our conference and gave the keynote speech. And what was interesting is that when she talked about her coining the term historical trauma, she said that it was a bit of a misnomer because, as you can see from the definition, it includes anything that happens over one's lifetime. So that is not just, history. It's not just my mom or my grandparents or my great-grandparents. It's including what happens in my lifetime, things that I may have experienced as a child that were traumatic, or as a young adult, or as I am now middle-aged. Everything that I have experienced that is traumatic within my lifetime, that's, not today and current trauma, is historical trauma. And the term intergenerational trauma really applies more to how one person's trauma can be passed to the subsequent generations. We also have some research that talks about the historical loss scale. In 2004, there was a study where they surveyed Native Americans who had children and asked them questions about their historical traumas. 36% had daily thoughts about the loss of traditional language in their community. 34% experienced daily thoughts about the loss of culture. 24% reported feeling angry regarding historical losses. 49% provided that they had disturbing thoughts related to those losses. 46 of the participants had daily thoughts about alcohol dependency and its impact on their community. 22% of the respondents indicated they felt discomfort with white people, and 35% were distrustful of the intentions of the dominant white culture due to the historical losses that Native American people had suffered. So as you can see, even though it may have been things that happened in the past, are layers of historical trauma, that it does still impact people today. Particularly when it comes to abuse. The gauntlet is a specific form of abuse that was inflicted at Chippewa, and we've heard several different testimonies. And here's one quoted on the screen. It says, "I was 10 years old. They laid me over the bed, and 2 boys held my hands and 2 others my feet. Each boy had to hit me with a studded belt. If anyone let up, he had to take my place. I passed out and woke up in the infirmary. I was there for 2 weeks, and I had to sleep on my stomach. I still have the scars." They called it the gauntlet. Another student had described it as instead of being laid on the bed, they lined the boys up in 2 rows, and the one who was being punished had to run down through the middle, and the rest had to hit him with their belts. We do have a report of someone dying. A student died as a result of a gauntlet beating, and the student who was interviewed and gave that testimony still has PTSD from that experience to this day. As an elder, he says that he doesn't know if it was his blow that killed the boy. Those students were then forced to build the casket and bury that student after they had beat him to death. Also pictured on screen are a pair of child-size handcuffs, and these are from Haskell. So they are at the Haskell Museum there at Haskell University. So you can imagine that if somebody experiences abuse like that, that it may affect how they parent their children, or if they continue to suffer from PTSD, that it would affect their relationships throughout the rest of their life. We also know from testimonies that many students experience sexual abuse, and this one is often not talked about. And unfortunately, it's the one type of abuse that tends to kind of spread itself as victims then become abusers. Not in all cases, but it does happen. So there's some quotes on screen. There were tunnels built under the school that the abusers used to have access to the children in the dormitories at night while everyone slept. Another talks of molestation, rape, and being put in a coffin by a priest. One night, I went to the bathroom, and when I returned, a man was in my bed. I fought him off and found my sister and slept the night in her bed. The little boys in my dorm would be taken by the dorm workers at night. They would come back crying, and the older boys were molesting the younger boys. I was raped by older boys. How do you tell your wife or children? I would be screaming into my pillow. It happened over 300 times, and I still have physical problems. So besides having their culture and their language taken from them and experiencing abuse, their strengths were taken from them too. That being able to pray as they learned to pray, or as their ancestors prayed. They were forced to pray as Catholics and Christians. And one documentary that is available online, I believe it's on YouTube, called Our Spirits Don't Speak English, has an elder telling a story about a pretty poignant point that he makes about the fact that when you pray in English, your ancestors cannot understand you because they they spoke their tribal language. They don't speak English. So that is also a loss, a spiritual loss. The intergenerational trauma also includes some biological aspects. Recently, epigenetics has become a study, a term being used. There was a scientific study by Rachel Yehuda at Mount Sinai, and she studied at first the children of Holocaust survivors, and then she did subsequent studies with veterans and pregnant mothers who were present at 9/11. And all studies confirm the same thing, that the children of people who experience trauma or people who have PTSD, that their children are more likely to develop stress or anxiety disorders, that they have the same genetic markers as their parents do, the same genetic markers as though they themselves have PTSD. And what we also know is that the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was recently done talks about the effects of trauma on child development. So as one experiences trauma and they release adrenaline, the amygdala is activated and adrenaline rushes, and people go into flight, fight, freeze, or collapse. All those trauma responses, all those chemicals being released in a still developing brain do have effects in how the brain will continue to develop and the patterns that the brain learns. So basically, those ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, become self-perpetuating. So, if you look to the top right, 2/3 of the adult population with at least one ACE, they are then 2 times more likely to experience physical health issues as adults, 3 times more likely to experience mental health issues as adults, and 87% have multiple ACEs. And then they have children, and those children are raised by an adult with ACEs, are then 1,000 times more likely to suffer their own adverse childhood experiences. And then they become adults with ACEs. And so you can see how the cycle continues. So, but there is hope for healing. Absolutely, there is hope. If we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and it's in our DNA. And I would also add to that quote that we have the strength of our ancestors with us. And, it depends on how you look at the epigenetics. If you want to say that being having that PTSD response is a negative or a positive. In some cases, if you're in a calm environment and you're prone to overreacting or having anxiety, then, maybe that's a detriment. But if you're continuing to be in a stressful or traumatic environment, then being prone to that response is actually an asset, which is why it developed in the first place. So we definitely have a lot of strength and resiliency, and Dr. Braveheart talks about the process of moving forward from our historical grief, that first we must confront the historical trauma, and second, we need to understand the trauma and how it's affecting us, and third, we work to release the pain of that trauma, and lastly, we are then able to transcend and release and have peace from that trauma. Studies have shown that language and culture in our communities are key to healing our historical trauma. And we like to say, let all that is Indian in you live. If we were told to let it all die, we should be really re-engaging with our language and culture. And as that was a direct legacy of the boarding school, was loss of our language and culture, then revitalizing our language and culture is direct healing from the boarding school experiences. So we do have some resources on our website that talk about things that you can do to take care of yourself spiritually, mentally, emotionally, and physically. as well as, if you need to reach out for counseling. What we don't have on the website is, for all the various Native communities around the country, access to your traditional spiritual leaders and healers. But we do have information about counseling and Western ways of dealing with your trauma. We also have our Healing Voices story collection that we are working on. And one thing about that story collection is that we want to lift up those voices. We want to hear from people and share those stories of people who experienced boarding school abuse or hardships. We want to break that silence, like my grandfather who didn't want to talk about it, and like my family who didn't share about my great-grandfather going to Carlisle. We need to talk about these stories in our families and in our communities. We need to, as Dr. Braveheart said, confront the trauma and understand the trauma. So our Healing Voices story collection uses the hashtags Break the Silence and Begin the Healing. But these are boarding school stories of hope. They're not focusing so much on the trauma. They acknowledge that there may have been traumatic experiences, but these stories instead focus on a healing journey that the student experienced afterwards in order to inspire others to healing and focusing on our resiliency as Native peoples. This is Patsy Whitefoot. She's a past board member, and she was our first interviewee for the Healing Voices series. And she said, we need to continue to hold up our children, our babies, because that's who we are in the future beyond our life here. And so that is what we keep in mind, is that we're doing this for our children. And as far as the Boarding School Healing Coalition, we center our programs around education and advocacy, all to inform healing and to support healing. And what we found is that there is a real need for the truth here in the US, which means that we need research. So before we can, like the transcending of the historical trauma, before we can do anything, before we can have reconciliation, before we can heal and be at peace, we need to understand, we need to confront and acknowledge, and we need to have the truth about what happened here in the US. We need to know exactly how many boarding schools we had. We need to know exactly how many children were sent there and exactly how many children died. In Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had court-ordered records. So what happened in Canada is that there was a class action lawsuit, and the government settled, and the class action claimants used the settlement funds to create the commission. And so the government court ordered, as part of the commission, for all the records to be brought forth from the churches and from the federal schools that they had in Canada. And it took 8 researchers 10 years to go through those records and do some preliminary analysis. And what they found was that there were 6,000 children who died or went missing at 150 schools in Canada. Now, if the US has 357 schools, then how many of our children died or went missing? And the truth is, we don't know. We don't know the exact number, and that is why we need the records. We don't have a commission here. We can't do a class action lawsuit because of the statute of limitations. And what we really are faced with is trying to find these records ourselves and do independent research. So some of the categories that we've divided the research into, and it's cross-discipline, but one would be the history of the boarding schools, so the actual hard data, the records, just the facts about the boarding schools and the students. And then another area would be the personal stories. That would be, the testimonies, the research interviews. And another area would be the impacts of the intergenerational trauma. So, some of what I shared already about like epigenetics and ACEs and things like that. And then the final area of research that's being done and that we continue to do is how communities are healing, how we have Native-led healing going on of that historical trauma today. So on our website at boardingschoolhealing.org, we do have some of these educational resources and reference to these pieces of research. We also have, oh, sorry, I'll go back. So as you can see from this screenshot of our homepage, on the upper right-hand corner, it says resource database. And so that's where you would go to find a lot of this information. And then this slide is just an example of some of the limited information that we have. So using one of our resources that we have listed in the database, we noted that in 1926, the Indian Office estimated that nearly 83% of Indian school-age children were attending boarding schools. In 1900, there were 20,000 children in boarding schools. In 1925, there were 60,889 children in boarding schools. But beyond these statistics, we don't have the full scope. We don't have the full numbers. But what we do have is a list of the boarding schools. And as far as we know, this is the most comprehensive list of boarding schools in the U.S. This was compiled by Dr. Denise Lashmadier, one of our founding board members. And she found 357 schools, and the list is still growing. There are 64 boarding schools still open today. And I myself was astonished at that number. I did, when I started this job, I didn't know that there were that many boarding schools that were still open. These boarding schools were across 30 states, and the top 5 states with the most boarding schools were 78 in Oklahoma, 51 in Arizona, 31 in Alaska, 25 in New Mexico, and 23 in South Dakota. And the 12 denominations that ran various boarding schools are listed, but that is also being updated. As we know, some of that information was inaccurate, and so we're updating that in our next publication. So as I mentioned, we're interested in knowing what happened to all these students. We know that not all would survive, and this picture that's on screen is a before and after of students that were taken to Chippewa, and on the left is 12 students, and on the right is 11 students. And we know from some of the research that's being done by scholars like Preston McBride, who will be doing our second webinar of the series next month, he's research on death rates at various schools. We know that a lot of times children died from disease. So, they were placed in very close quarters. Health examinations were as short as 20 seconds per child, according to research that was completed by Dr. Patty Lowe. And there were also children who died of abuse, children who died of malnourishment, and what they call failure to thrive, which means that they just gave up on life and they died. And also here's some more information about death rates at Carlisle. In 1890, 49 children per 1,000 died, and that is much higher than the average U.S. death rate at that time. There were 293 deaths reported, and 1,135 were sent home because they were too sick to remain. So that's the other thing, is that many of these boarding schools have cemeteries. Almost all of them have cemeteries because children died there and were buried there instead of being sent home. In some cases, parents wrote to the school and asked for their children to be returned, and the school said they couldn't afford it. And neither could the parents. So the children were buried there. But they were also sent home before dying at the school in some cases. They died on the way home or shortly after getting home. This slide talks about the cemetery at Chippewa, and we know that a researcher named Marcia Small went there and did ground penetrating radar and found what looked like students buried on top of students. So we know in Canada that they had unmarked graves, and that they found graves of infants, and that in some cases those were the result of rape at the school. And at Chippewa here, the cemetery contains over 220 students who died at the school. And you can see that it doesn't really look like a cemetery. It's not marked very well, and the headstones are not up rising up out of the ground. They are starting to be overrun, and the cemetery is not being cared for very well. And when I talk to officials at the Chippewa school, they're not sure whose jurisdiction the cemetery is under, because the Lummi tribe wanted to deliver some totem poles in a healing ceremony and have them placed at the cemetery. And there's questions about whether the cemetery is under the jurisdiction of the Bureau of Indian Education or the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so there's some bureaucracy that needs to be transcended there before they can even put totem poles there for healing. This is a photo of Tlingit elder Bob Sam. He was at our conference in Carlisle, and he's praying there at the cemetery. He's working to repatriate some Alaskan Native children who are buried there. Carlisle is the first boarding school that has started to repatriate children from their cemetery. And this is the result of 2016 request from both the Northern Arapaho and the Rosebud Sioux tribes. They requested to have their relatives repatriated, and the Army agreed. And much to everybody's surprise, they didn't fight, and they said, "We'll do it, and we'll pay for it." And then they opened the invitation to all the tribes who have children buried there. So in 2017, NABS held a tribal roundtable and invited the 59 tribes who have children buried there, and shared information from the Northern Arapaho. We invited them to share, and basically, wanted to assist with anyone who wanted to go through this repatriation process. Not all the tribes want to do that. Some of them don't have ceremonies for reburial, and some of the tribes who don't have those ceremonies are creating new ceremonies for the reburial. So it's up to each tribe, and that repatriation is ongoing, but it's opened up the question about other boarding schools and repatriating the children at other cemeteries. And so NABS is doing research to look into the schools that had cemeteries and find information about who owns the land. Carlisle's a unique situation because that school is on an Army barracks and is now, instead of being Carlisle Indian School, it's now the Army War College. And so because it's on federal land, the Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for that cemetery. In other cases, like Chippewa, like I mentioned, when it's not clear who's in charge of the cemetery, it would be, a whole nother issue to see who could be responsible for repatriation, if it would have to be the tribes themselves, or so it's a case-by-case situation with repatriation from these cemeteries. And one unique situation with Alaskans is that they weren't a state when Carlisle was a school, and the children that were sent from Alaska were orphans. And so part of the repatriation going on at Carlisle requires an affidavit from a family member. And so in the case of these orphans, they're looking to see if the tribe can request those children. This is a copy of a blueprint that is online at a digital archive, and it's Dickinson College created a digital archive of the Carlisle Indian School records. So a lot of these records are held in National Federal Archives, and the Genoa Indian School records are also in the process of being digitized by the Nebraska University. The Indigenous Digital Archive down in Santa Fe has some boarding school records from the Albuquerque and Santa Fe Indian schools. And so digitization of these records is starting to happen piecemeal, and NABS wants to create a national digital archive. But as you can see from some of the records that they took from Carlisle and put on the Dickinson archive, they have death records and information detailing about the cemetery. There are graves that are marked unknown there, and so they've been able to do some research to make educated guesses about where people are buried, because like I said, some of those graves are marked unknown, meaning some of the students are missing as far as where they're buried. And in those cases, whether we just don't know where they're buried or we don't know what happened to them, NABS is working with the Native American Rights Fund, the International Indian Treaty Council, the Saginaw Chippewa Tribe, and Rosebud Tribe on a filing to the United Nations on missing children. And what we're hoping to do is put together a list that talks about children who went missing, who were taken into federal custody and then never heard from again. Then their whereabouts are still unknown. And so that meets the criteria for a submission to the United Nations Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearances. And that working group has the authority to launch an investigation. And hopefully, if they do, then the U.S. will be forced to answer for the children who went missing at boarding school. We're also working on a survey with the University of Minnesota and the First Nations Repatriation Institute to look at child removal in the U.S., the connection between boarding school, Indian adoption, and foster care, and also the impacts of child removal. So watch for that survey. We're going to be launching that hopefully in the next month. We also developed a boarding school curriculum with the National Indian Education Association. It's a professional development curriculum that focuses on trauma-informed schools. The next phase of curriculum will be for high school students, but before we opened up this sensitive subject, which could, trigger people's emotions, we wanted to make sure that the school professionals were aware of how to deal with trauma and the impacts. So that is a training workshop that is available. If you're interested, you can contact us and we can tell you more about it. This is a slide that talks about the locations of the federal archives. So there are 9 national archives, and what we know is that there are 61 boarding school records within these 9 national archives, but that means there's 283 boarding school records that we don't know where they're located. So we're missing 80% of the records, and we're thinking that these records must be from church-run schools, so they might be in church archives. They could also be in local, either state, county, or other historical archives. And so we have a monumental task ahead of us to locate the records from all the boarding schools. This is just a screenshot of our database that I mentioned earlier. So if you go online, you can create a login for free, and you can search by the areas of historical context, personal stories, intergenerational impacts, or healing today. You can also search by category or document type. And as you can see, we've listed the different national archives that have the records. And if you click on one of those, then you'll be able to see what schools they have in their records. So if you're interested in actually going to one of those archives and looking at the records, you can find more information on our database. So what we're hoping will happen if we can do a national archive, if we can locate all the records and put all the records together, is that putting them online increases access. So instead of people having to travel to those various archive locations around the country, that they would have access to research from wherever they're at online, and also that, like they did in Canada, once we have all the records together, that there can be much better analysis of and a creation of the full picture and the true story of what happened with the boarding schools. So ultimately, our vision aims to restore the cultural sovereignty that was taken away through the boarding schools, and that sovereignty includes the right to set the terms of healing and reconciliation. We support data sovereignty, which is this concept that means basically, if the information is about Native peoples, that you should do tribal consultation and consult with Native scholars before moving forward with any research that has to do with Native people. Also, we are on social media. Please follow us and share and help us get the word out. And we are going to open it up for Q&A now. So I did pretty okay on my time. We've got, about 12 minutes left on the webinar. So go ahead and use the sidebar where it says questions to type me your questions. We have one already that asks, will the slides be available for download? Not quite technically for download. We are recording today's webinar, and that includes the audio and the visual, so you'll be able to see the slides. And we will share that recording on our website. It'll be placed in our database at a later time so that people can go ahead and access that, both for people who weren't able to attend today and if you wanted to go back through and find any references.